I think the reality is that people will protest and protest on the streets if they feel they're not being heard. They will express their frustrations and their anger in a variety of ways if they feel they are disrespected and ignored. And in my experience, that sort of protest really ought to be a last resort. Why? Because I don't actually believe at the end of the day, in any event, that violence is the answer to anything. Also, and significantly, unfortunately, in any given situation, if people take to the streets in circumstances of violent disorder, there will be some people who get hurt, and there'll be other people who will take the opportunity to commit acts of pure criminality. So what can start as a legitimate protest expressing frustration and anger at real grievances can become something very different indeed. But, you know, we shouldn't kid ourselves. The history of struggle is littered with examples of action that caused people to come out onto the streets. And that's part of the process of political change. And it happens. And certainly if you look at the history of the development of democracy in Britain, going way back to the Levellers and then the Chartists in the 19th century, the suffragettes in the late 19th and early 20th century, all of that did involve protest. It involved demonstration. It involved, at times, coming into conflict with the law. And yet, out of those things came our current democratic system in which ordinary people have the right to vote, women have the right to vote. None of those things happened without the uprisings and protests of former years. And the Brixton uprisings were a part of that continuum, a part of that process. And I respect that fact and indeed see it as part of the process by which we ensured in this country that people of all races, of all backgrounds, had a voice. Because the reality of Brixton prior to 1981 was that black people, and black young people in particular, were living in very oppressive circumstances. We didn't have black people in positions of authority. We were disrespected by the police on a daily basis. And the uprisings helped change that, and certainly helped pave the way to the more vibrant and inclusive multiracial democracy that we have in Britain today. For me, 1981 was about a sense of powerlessness on the part of the overwhelming majority of people who lived in Brixton. And that powerlessness was certainly affected by the sense that people weren't able to work, they weren't able to get jobs, they were denied opportunities, and that's a disempowering phenomenon. But also, it was made that much worse by oppressive policing. Policing that used tactics of overwhelming force, policing that was very often racist, frankly. Black people were discriminated against in terms of stop and search and the sus laws. Black people were subject to frequent racist abuse by the police, and they suffered injustice at the hands of the courts. So for me, the overwhelming priority in 1981 was to have a police service, was to have a group of police officers that were more representative of the community in terms of their ethnic makeup, that didn't treat people with disrespect, and where they were disciplined if they failed to treat people with respect, and where they built partnerships in order together to create safe and secure communities. They didn't do any of those things. So when subsequently I did become a police minister, the minister for police, in 1998, my priority was community policing. My priority was to deliver on the Macpherson report so that we had a police service that was drawn in terms of its makeup from a broad cross-section of the community, and a police service which exercised its powers of stop and search with greater discretion. But I and many others didn't just leave it until such time as we won political representation, until such time as we won a voice in Parliament, which happened in 1987. For us, we had to try and remove current grievances, and the greatest of those, in terms of something that ruined the relationship between the police and the public, and young black people in particular, but young people in general, were the sus laws. And so a group of women from southeast London got together and they started a campaign, a grassroots campaign. As it happened, they asked me to be their legal advisor. And the main thrust of that campaign was to remove the legal basis upon which people were being stopped and criminalized through an unjust law. And indeed, after the uprisings and the Scarman report, after a broad-based campaign that involved the churches, it involved all the political parties, at the end of the day, that law was repealed. So, there are always things that people can do. It's not just a question about, well, what are the MPs going to do? What are the ministers going to do? You have to ask ourselves, what can we do to make a difference? And my belief is that people, by getting together, by being focused, by being organized, can make a difference. I think for me, Brixton in the 80s, and indeed Brixton now, was a vibey, multicultural place. You got a sense when you came out of the tube, you came out of the Victoria line, that you were coming into somewhere that was different. And indeed, in terms of the music, in terms of the food, because don't forget, in those days in the 80s, now you can be in Bournemouth and you can buy ackee and saltfish in the supermarket. Believe you me, in the 1980s in Bournemouth you couldn't, but in Brixton you could. So we could get the sort of foods that we wanted. You could buy plantains, you could buy yams. There was and there still is a vibrant street life. So the market then was even more lively than it is now. And for someone, like myself, a young person who had been brought up when I was in the UK, in a place like Hemel Hempstead, where in those days there were very few black people, simply to be able to go into a shop and buy black hair products, that was a big thing. And you just felt you were part of a vibrant, international, multicultural community. And people got on. Black, white, African, Caribbean. It was in a happy place and a place where people stood together. And that's why when you look at the uprisings, we should never forget that white people and white young people were actively involved in those, alongside black youngsters. So it wasn't and never was a race riot. The Americans could never quite understand that. I remember being interviewed on ABC and NBC and that sort of show in the immediate aftermath of the uprisings. And they thought they were witnessing some sort of a race riot. So you just had to point out, well, actually, that wasn't the case. And that there was many white people involved as there were black, that this was a community that felt neglected. And we were neglected. Unemployment was high. We felt we were being unfairly policed. There wasn't investment in our infrastructure. And it was a cry of protest, really, about neglect. But the community came together. The community came together after the uprisings to deal with the fallout, and the community stayed together despite all the media interest and the sort of politicking that went on. And I think that's always been a good thing about Brixton. We loved it and we were happy to live here. For me, at every stage of my life, actually, it's always been important to get a balance between the life of the spirit and material life. Because there's more to us as human beings than simply the physical practicalities of day-to-day living, and there's more to the world than people making decisions on the basis of some sort of immutable market-driven economic rules. We are, as human beings, rich and complicated and muddled and wonderfully diverse, and you can't understand that by mechanistic rules alone. So for me, to try and understand our world and to get through it, to have some sense of the life of the spirit, has always been very important. And I come from an African tradition, the tradition in which I was brought up, in which for us living in those circumstances, this world, the world hereafter, and the world that went before, in terms of our ancestors, they're all interconnected, and there's a sort of semi-permeable membrane. So you pass in and out of these various different states, and that's why, for instance, just to give you a practical example of it, if you are an African, whenever I'm traveling in Africa, I'm always described not as Paul Boateng the lawyer, or Paul Boateng the cabinet minister, or the diplomat. I'm described as Kweku Boateng's son. Everybody is a son or daughter of someone else. And there's a totally different sort of relationship between the here and now and the past and the future. So for me, the life of the spirit has always been important. And in terms of my own particular spiritual tradition, it's a Christian one. I believe in the God of love. I believe in the sacrifice that our Lord made for us. I believe that if you embrace love as a driving force in the world, wonderful things can happen. Love not as some sort of soft sentiment, but love as a strategy. And I've seen it at work in the world. I was around in South Africa as it happens, as a Christian ecumenical activist. I was vice moderator of the World Council of Churches program to combat racism. And I remember going to a church service in Soweto, in the height of the state of emergency of apartheid in 1988. A youngster, 12, 13, was arrested for giving out a hymn sheet in a service in which Archbishop Tutu and myself were preaching. He was arrested. Bishop Hurley, great Catholic bishop and activist for justice, and me, a young British MP, went down to the police station to try and get him released. Didn't make a blind bit of difference at all. He was held in prison without trial, appeared 10 months later. And it was a vicious racist regime, and everybody thought except people like Archbishop Tutu and the people who embraced the gospel of love, everybody thought it would end with a bloody, violent revolution. And yet it didn't. And through the wonder, actually, of church and politics and trade unionism and just ordinary people in business, in the community, just coming together and saying, this can't work, this can't be right, and having a sense that there ought to be another way that was based not on violence, but on love, it changed it. Just as Martin Luther King changed things in the United States when they were fighting the Jim Crow laws and fighting racism and segregation in the US. So in all of those movements, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you know, I can remember a time when people were smuggling Bibles into Eastern Europe, and the wall collapsed. So, you know, I see time and time again, even now in my life and my work on the development front in Africa, I see whole villages transformed in terms of their relationship to the soil, to the produce of the land, transformed in terms of their relationships one to the other by the gospel of love rather than of hate and division. And so I just see it happening around me. So I think we all, there's a part of all of us that wants a spiritual life. And I think we have to embrace it and we have to find it in our own way. My way happens to be through a love of Christ. Others will worship Allah, will be Buddhists, will be Hindus. But I think not to have a faith at all and not to be seeking and going on some sort of spiritual journey, I think that would be very sad, because there's more to us than just, you know, bones and blood and sinews and impulses and mechanistic laws. You know, the life of the spirit and integrating the two. There was a great African educationalist called Dr. Agre, and he talked about the benefits of education. And he said the 3 R's are all very well, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic, but you've also got to have the 3 H's. Education of the head, so that you can be wise. Education of the hand, so that you can be practical. And education of the heart, so that you can recognize that what really brings about change in our world and transformation is the change in our hearts, that spiritual aspect of our lives, and getting that in the right place. And I believe that. I don't think you can compare what happened last year with what happened in 1981. 2011 and 81 were very different. Because at the end of the day, 1981 was an uprising. True, there was a criminal element that came along and got involved and tried to take the opportunity to steal some stuff. But it was an uprising. It was an uprising against an oppressive policing system, against an oppressive economic state, a depressed and deprived neighborhood where people were not being listened to and where people were not represented. And it was sparked off by a particular policing operation in 1981 and by the killing and wounding of a particular individual in 1985. 2011 was almost like sort of shopping with violence. You know, there was an element of just pure opportunistic criminality and planned criminality. And I didn't feel that the economic circumstances and the circumstances of policing were in any way comparable with those that occurred in 1981. But from all such incidents, you have to learn one lesson, that something is terribly wrong. Now, I think it's a different thing in 2011. In 1981, black people were not participating in the economy. They were not represented on the local authority in Parliament. They were not members of the police force. There was no police authority to hold the police to account. Young people were disrespected and had nothing. It was a bad situation. 2011, something else is going on, and it's not that, but it is something. There is a sense of alienation, undoubtedly. There is a sense of a breakdown of community and responsibility, one for the other, and there is a totally sort of amoral approach to acquisition. It seems to be okay just to take if you can. Now, that tells us something about the state of our society. So we need to listen to that and to learn from it. And we've got to find a response that isn't just about the criminal justice system and locking people up. We've got to ask ourselves how we build stronger and more respectful communities, how we give young people in particular a sense that they've got a stake in society, but how we take a greater degree of responsibility for our own lives and our relationships with others. Because what was striking too about 2011 were that there were people taking part who had jobs, who had careers, who had a whole heap going for them. It wasn't as if it was an action simply by the dispossessed. There was something else at work that I think is very worrying. So we shouldn't just have a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, lock them all up. That may be, the criminal justice system has to be part of it, but we also have to ask ourselves, where as a society are we going? How can we recapture our sense of community and our values? And I always think too, it's quite interesting to look at communities that didn't riot last year. I mean, I happen to live in one, in Wembley and in Harlesden, where are also diverse, multiracial communities, where there are a whole heap of issues, but there weren't riots, and there weren't people behaving as they behaved in Croydon. So we need to ask, what are we doing right as well as what are we doing wrong, and how can we do more that is right to stop this sort of thing?